old, so I think it's time for us to start. My name is Lindsay Koo, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the IGRCT, the Institute for Greece, Rome, and the Classical Tradition here at the University of Bristol, to our annual Sir Jeremy Morse Lecture. The Institute was founded in 2000 by Professor Bob Fowler, who is here today, and we work to promote research across the full range of Greco-Roman culture, ranging from antiquity to the present day. But there's a particular focus in the Institute on work that connects the ancient and the modern, and we promote activity into literature, philosophy, archaeology, all manner of aspects of the ancient world. Our Morse Lecture is one of our two flagship annual events that are open to the public, along with our Donors Lecture. And the Morse Lecture is named in memory of Sir Jeremy Morse, who was the former Chancellor of the University and also President of the IGRCT. And Sir Jeremy and his wife, Lady Belinda, were very steadfast and very loyal supporters of the Institute. So it's always a really great pleasure for us at the Institute to acknowledge that long and very supportive relationship every year. So without any further ado, I'm really delighted to introduce our distinguished speaker for this year, Professor Stephanie McCarter, who is Professor of Classical Languages at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. We did check how to pronounce that earlier. Professor McCarter works on the Latin poetry of the late Republic and the early Roman Empire. She is known for her monograph entitled Horace, Between Freedom and Slavery, the first book of epistles, which was published with the University of Wisconsin Press in 2015. But she is also, of course, very widely known outside of academia for her brilliant work as a literary translator, the topic of our lecture today. In particular, for her verse translations of Horace's Odes and Epodes, published with the University of Oklahoma Press in 2020, and the topic of today's lecture, her translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, published with Penguin Classics in 2022. And her translation of Ovid received the Harold Morton Landon Translation Award from the Academy of American Poets. So a very garlanded achievement. We're absolutely thrilled to have Professor McCarter here as the latest in a long line of very distinguished speakers. This is the 8th Morse Lecture, and we're delighted that we're able to promote connections like this with scholars from all over the world through this series of lectures. So without any further ado, please can you join me in welcoming our 8th Sir Jeremy Morse lecturer, Professor McCarter.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I'd like to begin just by expressing my gratitude for this invitation. Thank you especially to the Morse family and to the Institute of Greece, Rome, and the Classical Tradition. It is an immense honor to follow in the footsteps of so many previous speakers I greatly admire. Thank you to Eleanor Gorman for reaching out with the invitation, and to Ian Calvert for agreeing to offer a response. I'm also grateful to Jessica Weeks and to Flo James for their masterful assistance, and to the many students who've extended hospitality to me. I wanted to begin by offering a content note that this lecture will contain descriptions of sexual violence. If you need to take a moment, I will completely understand. Literary translations by classicists, by which I mean individuals whose primary research and teaching are focused on Greek and Roman literature, language, and culture, remain something of a rarity. There are, of course, important exceptions to this generalization, with major translations penned in recent years by classicists such as Sheila Murnaghan, Shadi Barsh, Diane Rayer, Oliver Chaplin, Frederick Ahl, Joanna Hannock, Peter Green, Emily Wilson, and others. Indeed, Wilson's editions of Homer have received unprecedented attention, giving classical translation a heightened profile in the field and beyond. Yet such translations have historically not regularly counted toward tenure and promotion, and my focus here is admittedly on the US system with which I am most familiar. To quote translation theorist Lawrence Venuti, a decision to dedicate one's research and scholarship to translation in any form continues to be tantamount to jeopardizing one's academic career. The reasons for this are varied. Translation seems to some more like a service activity than an original contribution to scholarly knowledge, while for others, translation inescapably remains little more than an inferior version of an original text. Translation thus seems trapped in a secondary status. Such views are fueled by the assumption that translation is a mechanical process whereby one language's words are simply transmuted into another language's corresponding words. In truth, translation braids together the scholarly and the creative in order to fashion a new artistic product. It is an interdisciplinary practice that, to quote the Modern Language Association, is at once critical and creative, that demands lexical precision, detailed knowledge of historical, political, social, and literary contexts, and a nuanced sense of style in both the source language and the target language. I would add that translators, due to the difficult choices they must make, have a unique ability to put forth daring new interpretations that challenge longstanding assumptions about texts and that can give canonical works fresh appeal to changing audiences. The reason why classics as a field has not embraced translation differ from those for modern languages. Whereas modern foreign language pedagogy favors immersive approaches and thus, to quote Venuti again, minimizes or excludes English language translation, ancient language pedagogy has employed translation as a tool, not for literary creativity, but for demonstrating understanding of the original Greek or Latin. This often results in the clunky artificial language dubbed translationese. It's the kind of translation I was trained to do as a student. Furthermore, translation, which by nature aims to make ancient literature accessible to new audiences, runs counter to the exclusivity the field of classics has long embraced. As Edith Hall has elucidated, as classics coalesced as a field, reading in translation was associated with the working classes, which in her words, produced a pronounced prejudice amongst most establishment scholars against being discovered studying the ancient authors even with the aid of a translation. Classics programs today still rarely offer training in producing, analyzing, and reviewing literary translations, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of people who read ancient literature do so in translation, both inside and outside of the classroom. Particularly in non-language courses, i.e. the bread and butter courses at many institutions, we have come to rely on a mode of writing that, as a field, classics undervalues, regarding it as something of a necessary evil. I suspect that the exclusion of translation from classics is one reason why classicist-authored translations often meet with suspicion on the other side of the aisle as well, i.e. from creative writers. It has indeed become axiomatic that it takes a poet to translate a poet, and this is somewhat justified. For a translation to succeed, it must be effective as a work of art in its own right. Yet, as many classicists who have tried to teach from a highly poetic rendering can attest, such translations do not always keep intact what we find meaningful in the original, often blurring translation into adaptation. Classicists, I believe, are uniquely trained in the kind of close reading of Greek and Latin texts that can bear creative fruit in translation, and our knowledge of the ancient past helps us reflect it accurately. In my own translation work, I aim to bridge the divide between classics and creative writing, producing translations of ancient literature that feel and sound like poetry while also being firmly anchored in my classics training. My talk today outlines key ways in which my research and teaching in the field of classics inform my translation work in both its style and its substance. The first part focuses on how I channeled my habits of close reading into the composition of formal poetry. The second considers how I drew on my knowledge of Greco-Roman cultural norms in interpreting Ovid's themes of rape, gender, sexuality, and the body. I hope this talk will make a case not only for more classicists to take up translation, but also, and perhaps more importantly, for their work to be valued within institutional settings when they do. The biggest worry for me as I embarked on translation was my lack of poetic training, though my first love was and remains English literature, which I studied at university along with classics. In 2018, while I was still puzzling over what kind of translator I wanted to be, I read an interview in The New Yorker with Pulitzer Prize-winning writer Jeffrey Eugenides that helped guide my path. In it, Eugenides explains that studying Latin was formative for him. He says, "I've said this before, but studying Latin was a huge influence on me as a writer. Learning a language with declensions and cases makes you aware of sentence structure and grammar in an almost palpable way. In addition, having to translate a literary text like the Metamorphoses or the Aeneid line by line taught me what close reading was and how much complexity a poet could engineer in a work. My Latin teachers were excellent too and paid attention to the minutest details of rhetoric, composition, and meter." When I read this interview, it occurred to me that I had already learned a great deal about how to compose poetry from Ovid himself. If I wanted to engineer good poetry in my translation, I knew I would have to use Ovid's own tricks. Regular meter gave me a welcome chance to build in poetic effects that mirrored those of the original. There has indeed been a veritable revival of form in recent years among classical translators, such as Emily Wilson, Aaron Puchigian, A.M. Juster, Diane Arnson-Savalian, A.E. Stallings, Sarah Rudin, and others. And I'm excited to be a part of that. Since dactylic is not a meter that comes naturally to English, I, like many others, used iambic pentameter, the meter that most immediately feels like poetry, especially epic poetry, to Anglophone readers. Meter became, to use a term introduced to me by my friend playwright Sherry Magid, an enabling constraint. It bound me into a fixed form, but by doing so, freed me from the overly literal and verbose translation I was used to doing, thereby fueling my creativity. Just as dactylic hexameter gave Ovid flexibility to create poetic effects with strings of quick dactyls, dum-diddy, 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 or slow spondies, dum, 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 the variations possible within iambic pentameter allowed me to replicate these effects where possible. Iambic pentameter, of course, consists of 5 iambs, the dum, the dum, the dum, the dum, the dum. Do not go gentle into that good night. Substitutions of trochees, stressed, unstressed, for iambs are occasionally allowed, especially in the first or fourth foot and after caesuras. Wordsworth, for instance, employs first and fourth foot trochaic substitutions in a line from the Prelude, "Over the sandy fields, leaping through groves." This produces speed and energy like Latin dactyls. One might substitute instead with slow, ponderous strings of spondies, as in Lady Macbeth's famous line, "That which hath made them drunk hath made me bold." Feminine endings create further variety by allowing an final unstressed syllable, as in Macbeth's, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" One can and should exploit these variations to good effect. Let me offer some examples of how I reproduced Ovid's metrical effects, as well as his poetic devices more generally. One comes from Juno's descent into the underworld in Book 4, where Ovid describes the punishments suffered by famous sinners, including Sisyphus, Ixion, and the Danaids. In my translation, "You, Sisyphus, retrieve or push the rock doomed to roll backward. Ixion is spun, chasing and fleeing from himself. The Danaids who dared to kill their cousins fetch water that will ever drain away." In line 460, you can see at the top, Ovid's alternating dactyls and spondies, "aut petis aut or geis reditorum Sisyphe saxum," dum diddy dump dump dum diddy dump dump dum diddy dump dump, suggests the repetition of Sisyphus's spondaic pushing and the rock's quick dactylic rolling. I imitated this with "the rock doomed to roll backward," Ixion, where the metrical inversion, "doomed to roll back," is meant to imitate the swift rolling, while the 3 stresses in a row, backward, ix, resume his slow pushing. Similarly, in the following line, the inversion in "chasing and fleeing" evokes Ixion's swift spinning, which Ovid achieves through dactyls, "se sequitur que fugit." In the lines describing the Danaids, furthermore, Ovid alliterates P, "patruelibus repetunt perdant," which I echo with alliteration of my own, particularly of D, "Danaids dared drain." Elsewhere in book 3, the sailor Acoites tells how his crew was trapped at sea, then transformed into dolphins by the god Bacchus. I translate, I swear upon the God himself, no God is closer now than he, that what I say is just as true as it seems false. The ship stopped on the sea as if it were dry docked. Stunned, they persist, striking the oars, unfurling the sails, trying to go with twice the effort. Lines 661 to 2, these two right here, are heavily spondaic. You can see the air, quam, si, com, na, and then il, lod, mu, ron, tes, re, mor, rin. So lots of spondees. Commentator William Anderson suggests this reflects the crew's struggle, but I read it instead as mimicking the unexpected fixedness of the ship. Ovid then breaks into more dactyls in line 663, the final line here. So veloque dedu cunt gemina quape correre temptant, which to me evoke the crew's frantic attempts to row. I began my translation of line 661 with the emphatic inversion stopped, which combined with ship at the line end above gives the slow ship stopped. I coupled this with this spondaic dry docked at the line end before breaking into numerous trochaic inversions in the next 2 lines to depict the crew's frenzy. Stunned, they persist, striking the oars, trying to go. The feminine ending of line 662 produces a similar effect, unfurling the sails. Earlier in this same episode, I recreated another of Ovid's favorite devices, chiasm. Here, Acoites tells how he recognized at once that the boy his crew had kidnapped was the god Bacchus in disguise. And he illustrates the intertwining of divine and human form through his intertwined verbal arrangement. I translate, I do not know what God is in that body, but in that body, there's a God. My God in that body God, echoes Ovid's numen in isto corpora numen in isto. This particular chiasm must have been memorable to Lily Meyer, who interviewed me for the Poetry Foundation. She asked, to my delight, there are a lot of inversions along the lines of, I do not know what God is in that body, but in that body there's a God. Is a sentence like that equally repetitive in the Latin? And I could assure her that yes, it is. Anything memorable I may have achieved here came simply from paying close attention to Ovid's text. Elsewhere, Ovid similarly uses stylistic devices to forge and articulate relationships between key characters. In the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who are the couple that survived the flood in book 1, here Ovid introduces the husband and wife in a series of heavily patterned lines. I translate, Jove sees the pools engulfing all the world, and how from thousands just one man survives, and how from thousands just one woman too, both innocent, both worshippers of gods. I maintained Ovid's parallel language here, you can see in the blue, with Deucalion and Pyrrha each described with an entire line that is almost identical to the other, then sharing a line divided at the caesura with the repetition of ambo, both. Many other translators, however, lose this parallelism, as in the version by Alan Mandelbaum. He writes, and saw that just one man was left of those who had been myriads, but one woman had escaped the waves, 2 beings who were pious, innocent. The parallel language, however, is important because it shows the unity between Deucalion and Pyrrha, whose mutual love forms a powerful foil for the story of violent love that follows, that of Apollo and Daphne. I'll be talking about that story momentarily. In the tale of Alcyone and Ceyx, which is my favorite story in the Metamorphoses from book 11, Ovid evokes similar unity through interlocking word order. Alcyone begs her husband, her beloved husband, to let her join him on a doomed sea voyage, saying, together we will bear whatever happens while borne together through the open sea. Ovid's interlocking A-B language, pariter que feremos, pariter feremur, mirrors the shared love between this couple, who stand together whatever the circumstances, whether they act, feremos, or are acted upon, feremur. Alas, I could not keep the interlocking order in felicitous English, so I translated this chiastically instead. Together, bear, born, together. keeping the polyptyton, which is the same word in different inflections, of Ovid's pheremos, pheremor, in my bear born. This linguistic mirroring is missed by all the other translators I have consulted. For instance, Rayburn writes, "We shall share the danger and brave the waves in each other's company." Ovid creates a similar effect in the transformation of Baucis and Philemon in Book 8, with the result that his Latin mimics not only their shared affection, but also the intertwining of their boughs as they each become trees. He writes in my translation, Baucis saw leaves sprouting on Philemon, Philemon saw leaves sprout on Baucis too. I managed to keep Ovid's chiasm. Ovid has Philemona, Baucis, Baucida, Philemon, but I had to place Baucis's name first. Baucis, Philemon, Philemon, Baucis. Ovid's interconnected language mirrors the lack of hierarchy or division that characterizes their humble home more generally. As he tells us at the story start, it makes no difference if you ask for slaves or masters there. The house consists of two, and each alike give orders and obey. Sometimes Ovid uses repetition to make connections between characters from different tales, as he does with Procne and Hecuba. In Book 6, Procne's husband Tereus brutally rapes her sister Philomela and cuts out her tongue, after which Philomela weaves a tapestry depicting the crime and sends it to her sister Procne. At 6:586, after Procne reads the tapestry, Ovid describes her with the words koinai quinimagene totost, which I translate as consumed by thoughts of punishment. I keep this at 13:546, where Hecuba, distraught by the loss of her children in the Trojan War, is described by the same phrase. The repetition braids these women together as Ovid's foremost exemplars of women's grief-fueled rage, yet no other translator I have consulted maintains it. For instance, the most recent English translator, C. Luke Susi, renders the first line as "she hurled herself in dreams of her revenge," and the second, "consumed by her vindictive fantasies." One untranslatable stylistic feature, famously untranslatable feature of Latin verse is what has come to be known as golden or silver lines. These contain two nouns and adjectives arranged either chiastically, A-B-B-A, or in an interlocking arrangement, A-B-A-B, around a central verb. So here you can see, if I can get my thing to work, there's the central verb right here, resekuta es in frenebas. And here you have chiasm in the blue, these two go together, and then these ones in the yellow go together, and it's the same right here. This is impossible to pull off in English, given the constraints of word order. So I had to come up with a different way of achieving something of this effect when possible. And I hasten to add that it was often simply not possible. The solution I landed on was instead to use patterned alliteration. So for the interlocking line, Malia purpure is frenabas or capistris at 10:125, I translate sit on his back and use a scarlet bridle with interlocking SB alliteration. At 4:789, I translate the similarly arranged line et quaiac tatis tetigis cedera penis as using the patterned, though not interlocking alliteration, the stars he'd soared to on his whirring wings, so SSWW. Because it is not possible to translate all such lines with patterned alliteration, I simply started peppering the translation with such patterns when it did work. So at the end of the Golden Age, the Virgin Justice was last of gods to leave the gore-soaked lands with LGL alliteration. Or Narcissus exclaims, possessing all I long for leaves me poor, with PLLP alliteration. Marcius transforms into streams that bustle to the sea in sloping banks, BSSB. As Theseus and his company leave Achelous' cave, daylight comes and morning sunlight stripes the mountaintops, MSSM. A bit later, Achelous hides his mane torn by braiding reeds and willow round his brow, BRRB. These are examples not of me mirroring Ovid directly, but of me learning tricks and being inspired by him. Wordplay is another feature of Ovidian verse that I enjoyed recreating. In the interests of time, I will point out only a couple of examples. In book 14, Ovid describes the transformation of the kerkopes, but does not say exactly what they turn into, giving instead, as commentator Sarah Myers points out, a punning hint. He writes, dissimiles homini pas similes que videri, where Ovid's dissimiles, unlike, and similes, like, coupled by the word racemos in the following line, pun on the Latin word simia, which means ape, i.e., what they become. Such puns are a feature of the wit for which Ovid is famous. I imitated this with whose looks aped humans, yet did not ape humans. Again, other translators missed this pun entirely. A.D. Melville writes that they seemed both like and unlike humans, so translating those words very literally. Elsewhere in book 13, Ulysses and Ajax battle with words to claim the armor of Achilles. At 13:268-9, Ulysses says that what Ajax claims, refert with a short e, so the second bolded item, should not matter. Refert with a long e, so the first bolded item. After a full day of hand-wringing, I finally landed on the translation. You may not think it's worth the whole day's hand-reading, but and you should discount his account of fighting Trojans and Jove to save the Argive fleet. I felt it was crucial to maintain some wordplay here, since it helps to develop Ulysses' characterization as a clever speaker, which is ultimately what wins him Achilles' arms. This talk would go on for weeks, really, if I cited each example of how I built Ovid's poetic devices into my own. Suffice it to say, there are countless instances of wordplay, repetition, line patterning, chiasm, alliteration, and on and on and on. And trying to recreate these was one of the great pleasures of translating this grand epic text. I would, however, like to mention one final poetic goal as a segue to the next part of my talk. I wanted the language of this translation to be as clear and direct as possible, at times even to feel quite stark. In the words, again, of Lily Meyer, her language is as blunt as her poetics are formal. This was a key stylistic choice. Had I been translating a different epic, I might have aimed for a more elevated or archaic style, although personally, I don't lean towards archaic style. Compared to, say, Virgil or Lucretius or Statius, however, Ovid does not suit a heightened register. He is one of the most accessible Latin poets and should be equally so in English. For some, such plain accessibility does not poetry make. Indeed, the word poetic in English is used often as a synonym for ornate or flowery, neither of which I wanted my translation to be. My desire for transparent, even blunt language intersects with my aim not to water down the violence, pain, trauma, and abuse of power that weave many of these tales together. Particularly when translating Ovid's scenes of rape, of which there are many, I wanted my translation to be as unambiguous as Ovid's own. As someone who has taught Ovid numerous times in courses on women, gender, and sexuality in antiquity, I was attuned to these dynamics within the text to a degree that someone without that training would likely not be. Indeed, too often translators project later cultural baggage and assumptions onto the past, particularly when it comes to reticence about rape, constructions of gender in the body, and attitudes about sexuality. Often these projections result when one introduces ornate poetic language, ravish for rape, tresses for hair, bosom for chest, or when one inserts florid descriptors where there are none. My desire for accuracy was not just scholarly nitpicking on my part. Rape and its concomitant violation of another's body sits at the heart of what it means to lose one's bodily autonomy to forces beyond one's control. It itself enacts a metamorphosis. The pronounced presence of rape in the epic suggests that Ovid himself found such violence worthy of critical interrogation. To gloss over it or euphemize it is indeed to ignore one of his chief themes. The centrality of sexual violence in the epic has been well recognized in scholarship since the late 1970s, when Leo Curran could still describe rape as the dirty little secret of Ovidian scholarship. The tide has turned dramatically, and now anyone seeking academic articles about rape in Ovid will find a plethora of results. And this important work has shifted our understanding of the poem enormously and for the better. Translation, however, has been slower to change. In 1993, Zola Marie Packman wrote an important article criticizing the use of euphemism in the translation of Roman comedy, a genre similarly replete with sexual violence. Yet even into the 21st century, translators have continued to euphemize such scenes. Even when Ovid's translators have not shied away from the word rape, they often still resort to language that titillates or sexualizes. A translator's choices greatly impact how the text is understood in such scenes. If, for instance, a rendering seems to romanticize rape, it might be tempting to identify Ovid or the narrator as unambiguously sympathetic to perpetrators. A translation that accurately communicates the nuances of Ovid's narrative voice, however, opens up the possibility that the epic itself takes a critical stance toward the violence it contains. I therefore set clear strategies for myself in order to strip away some of the euphemisms and inaccuracies I saw repeatedly in the existing translations. These strategies include: translate rape as rape, not introducing language that romanticizes, euphemizes, or titillates. 2, critically interrogate the language around agency and consent, not implying a character has given consent when that is not clear in the Latin. 3, take special care when translating the body, not introducing gendered, sexualized, or racialized language not in the original. 4, avoid assuming a male heterosexual gaze as a default. 5, avoid misogynistic, sexist, and gendered language not explicit in the original. And lastly, avoid analyzing characters' motives through the lens of later stereotypes and biases. These strategies are deeply informed by my intersecting experiences as a scholar and a feminist. As I have argued elsewhere and will repeat here, feminist translation, to me, is a tool for accuracy. It helps one scrutinize one's biases while giving translators tools for interpreting the gender politics of the original. For the remainder of my talk, I will show how these strategies informed my translation of 2 key episodes, those of Daphne and Leucothoe. It will be necessary for me to draw some contrasts between my translation and others to show the difference of my approach. As a feminist scholar and as a feminist translator and Ovidian scholar, I wanted not merely to translate rape accurately, but also to illuminate how this theme intersects with larger concerns about power, gender, sexuality, identity, and especially the body. And if you were at the workshop yesterday, we talked about how Ovid mentions the body in the second line of the poem. So he forefronts this as a theme. In the story of Apollo and Daphne, Daphne's body is an important site for such negotiations. Hers is largely a story about a body, her desire to possess a virginal body, to have agency over what becomes of her body, and her reliance on others, especially her father, to give her that agency. Like all bodies, Daphne's is subject to violence and metamorphosis. Her story is about the danger of being viewed solely as a body and the dehumanizing violence of such a gaze. Her story asks us to ponder how a body relates to the identity it contains and how identity can linger even when the body is refashioned. Accurate translation of Daphne's body is therefore crucial to her story. Yet again and again, translators alter her body, sexualizing it to appeal to a presumed heterosexual reader. To a presumed male heterosexual reader. When Apollo gazes at Daphne prior to his pursuit, for instance, in my translation reads, seeing the loose hair down her neck, he says, suppose that it were styled. He sees her eyes gleaming like stars, her lips, but those it's not enough to see. He marvels at her fingers, her hands, her arms, her shoulders, nearly bare. The parts he cannot see, he thinks are better. We see through Apollo's eyes as they break her body down into an assemblage of parts. Yet even as Ovid objectifies her in this way, he holds back, allowing her some agency. Her hair remains defiantly unstyled, compelling Apollo to have recourse in his mind's eye to make a, scare quotes, proper woman of her. Much of Daphne remains hidden to Apollo's view, if not off limits to his imagination. There are, moreover, few adjectives here, Her eyes shine and her arms are nearly bare, but there is very little that would clearly gender Daphne's body or sexualize it. Her body thus accords with her desire to resist femininity and sexualization. She is not graceful or pale or soft in this moment, all attributes that Romans associated with feminine bodies. Yet translators again and again conform Daphne's body to ideas of feminine beauty and desirability. In A.D. Melville, for instance, Daphne has not hidden parts, as in my translation, but hidden charms. This right here, these are neuter plurals, and so there's no noun specified, so the translator has to decide what noun to put those with. So I put parts, Melville put charms. And the narrator interjects here a non-Ovidian, how exquisite. In Charles Morton, she has not lips, but a darling little mouth. David Rayburn gives her eyes that do not merely gleam like stars, instead the adjectives multiply. Her eyes are bright, burning, and twinkling. Her lips are teasingly tempting, her fingers delicate, her arms shapely. In Horace Gregory, she has highly feminized floating hair that fell in tendrils at her throat and forehead, more parts than even Ovid describes to her. In Alan Mandelbaum, her neck is fair, and her fingers, hands, and wrists unsurpassed, while her arms cannot be matched. In David Slavitt, she has marvelous fingers, tiny and lovable wrists, and a ponytail that whips the innocent air, all of which makes Apollo nearly cry out in pain. Such flourishes deny Daphne her own body even before her metamorphosis. On the one hand, they insist that her beauty must equate to stereotypical femininity, and on the other, they suggest that such beauty is inherently irresistible. Apollo, it seems, cannot help himself. This sexualization recurs in Daphne's transformation scene, where Apollo describes the bark, she turns into a laurel tree, describes the bark as rising up Daphne's Mollia praecordia. I translate that supple torso. This is the one time she is given the attribute of softness, here in contrast to the hard bark encircling her. In my translation, her prayer just spoken, dull weight grips her limbs, a slender bark unfolds her supple torso. Her hair sprouts up as leaves, her arms as branches. A stiff root clasps her foot, just now so swift. The treetop takes her mouth, just her gleam remains. Praecordia, what I call torsos, are features of male and female bodies. In fact, in Ovid's poetry, the word is used more often of male bodies, 14 times, than female ones, only 6 times. My favorite way, I'm going to go ahead and apologize for the images I'm about to show you. My favorite way to test the connotations of my word choice is to do a Google image search. And my phrase, supple torso, brings up mainly photos of dancers, both male presenting and female presenting, none of them heavily sexualized. In other words, the phrase simply does not have a powerful connotation. In Z. Philip Ambrose, however, the bark surrounds Daphne's soft bosom, a phrase evocative of feminine bodies, as also illustrated by a Google image search. In Rolfe Humphreys, Michael Simpson, and Jane Allison, bark rings her soft breasts. This draws our eye to parts Ovid never mentions, parts highly sexualized in the later Western tradition and often depicted in artistic representations of this scene. Yet even as our gaze has circled them, Ovid leaves Daphne's breasts defiantly unexposed. The most recent translator, C. Luke Susi, is generally more careful about the sexual politics of the text, but he still uses feminizing language here, translating Mollia praecordia as slender waist, a phrase that pulls up almost exclusively female-presenting bodies on Google Image. Some translators give Daphne's body the additional attribute of whiteness. Horace Gregory, for example, places the bark around her white thighs, giving her also white arms and a fair head. Rayburn similarly gives her a soft white bosom, which indeed is the pull quote on the back of the book. This whiteness does not correspond to anything in the Latin text at this moment. The word is simply not there. By calling Daphne white, translators risk retrojecting much later racial categories onto the text. The Greeks and Romans themselves did not racialize whiteness. and instead a pale skin hue was often used to mark gender, as shown in Greek and Roman art. It is true that a few lines earlier, Ovid describes Daphne as having become pale, but that signifies her fear in that moment, not her femininity. I have avoided describing anyone's skin as white, opting for words such as pale, especially when pallor is indicated, or radiant, glowing, or bright, especially when a word like candidus or candida is used. And this is a word that can describe like the shining sun. Yet such a hue is not even present at this point in Daphne's story. A feminizing complexion does not suit this gender nonconforming huntress, and racializing whiteness does not suit any character in the epic. Translations that sexualize and objectify the appearance of Daphne's body effectively align the reader with the voyeuristic Apollo. In my translation, I tried instead to explore Daphne's agency and experience of trauma. A seemingly small, but to me hugely important example of this comes at the end of her transformation, where I am the only translator who renders aura as mouth rather than face or head. So the treetop takes her mouth. Everybody else has face and head. You can see over on the right. I won't read them all. This is a key difference, since face and head focus us on the experience of looking at Daphne, whereas mouth suggests a function she has lost, i.e., her ability to speak. Compare the arboreal transformation of Dryope in Book 9, which is modeled on that of Daphne. Here, the aura is clearly aligned to speech. Her mouth had ceased to speak or be. It is this loss of voice that is the most psychologically devastating for the transformed throughout the epic. Even as translators objectify Daphne while she is a person, they personify her once she is an object. To be fair, Ovid's Latin is frustratingly and pointedly ambiguous after her metamorphosis into the laurel tree. Is it the tree Apollo now loves, or is it still her? Does Daphne remain inside that tree? Ovid tells us, "Hanc quoque foibus amat." Phoebus also loves this unspecified feminine noun. So there's no noun there to tell us what he loves, this what? This could refer to the grammatically feminine tree, arbor, or to Daphne, the grammatically feminine nymph, or to both at once. The tree seems simultaneously animate and inanimate, her and not her. This ambiguity cannot successfully be translated into English, which lacks grammatical gender. And so the translator must make hard choices. For most, the honk is still Daphne, a she. Tree though she was, Apollo loved her still, David Rayburn. And still Apollo loved her, A.D. Melville. Loving her still, Charles Martin. And yet Apollo loves her still, Alan Mandelbaum. Apollo loves her this way too, Jane Allison. But Phoebus loved her still, C. Luke Susi. Only Horace Gregory and I render honk with reference to the tree. I write that Apollo loves this too, beautiful tree. While Gregory says that Phoebus embraced the lovely tree and later stroked its branches. The rift between she and it, as Jacqueline Ardham has noted, is itself instructive. The more translations we look at, the more we see that Daphne exists in a sort of spectrum, with treeness at one end and humanness at the other. Yet there are good reasons to let Daphne simply be a laurel tree, an it in this moment. A key change has taken place in Ovid's Latin to signal that what she is now, honk, this, is fundamentally different from what she was. Daphne earlier was repeatedly, like throughout the entire story, designated by the word illa, that girl, that girl. Honk suggests instead only what has been left behind, this object in front of Apollo's eyes, the laurel tree itself. The retention of she suggests too strongly that Daphne actively consents to Apollo's appropriation of her leaves in the tale's closing lines. So I'll just read a bit. But since he said, "You cannot be my wife, you'll be my tree. You will adorn my hair, laurel, and you my lyre, and you my quiver. You'll grace the Latin leaders when glad voices proclaim a triumph in the Capitol views long parades. You'll guard most faithfully Augustus's doorposts and the oak between them. And since my head stays young with hair unshorn, the beauty of your leaves will never fade. To be told that she responds to this speech in any way is to remove Daphne's inscrutability as an object, the only agency she has left. In other words, her silence as a tree, a thing, has become a kind of resistance, another way for her to escape Apollo. There is still a part of her that he and we cannot access. My own translation focalizes the closing lines through the viewer alone. With new boughs, the laurel nodded. It seemed to sway its treetop like a head. Maybe she lingers in it, but it is all that Apollo can now see and interpret. We need to be as mystified as Apollo in this moment if Daphne's metamorphosis is to succeed. Other translators, however, suggest Daphne's clear consent here. Frank Justice Miller, in his Prose Loeb translation, writes, "The laurel waved her new-made branches and seemed to move her head-like top in full consent." A.D. Melville writes, "The laurel, in assent, inclined her new-made branches and bent down, or seemed to bend, her head, her leafy crown." And David Rayburn, "With a wave of her new-formed branches, the laurel agreed, and seemed to be nodding her head in the treetop." In Charles Martin, "It is less her body than her name that changes. Laurel shook her branches and seemed to nod her summit in assent." Ralph Humphreys restores her voice in this moment, giving her one last submissive word. The laurel, stirring, seemed to consent to be saying yes. Even Horace Gregory, who had emphasized treeness before, reverts to she in this moment. The laurel shook her branches and seemed to bow a timid blessing on her lover's pleasure. Such translations effectively mitigate Apollo's violence by making Daphne herself sanction it. I have tried instead to restore agency back to Daphne by letting her silence speak. Although Daphne's transformation thwarts her rape, other characters do not escape, and Ovid's language leaves no doubt that what they experience is a crime. And Sheridan James has written a lot about this. The most common Latin word Ovid uses for rape is vis, force. This was a legal term for rape in Rome, although it was also applied to other violent acts, such as armed insurrection or wielding weapons within the city's bounds, acts that undermine the Roman citizens' expectation of bodily autonomy and freedom, libertas. Punishments for rape by vis ranged from personal retaliation to loss of citizenship and even death. One egregious instance of translators framing vis, or vis as we could say, as consensual sex is the rape of Leucothoe in Book 4. And this is a story I've written. I wrote about at the very start of embarking on this translation, but I wanted to revisit it now that the translation has been out there a bit and expand on some of my earlier arguments. In this story, the son gazes at Leucothoe relentlessly, and this gaze, as so often in the epic, foreshadows sexual violence. He then sneaks into her room at night, dresses her mother, and after dismissing the enslaved women who were spinning thread with her, appears in his full bright splendor. The key passage reads, in my translation, "She shakes with fright. In her alarm, the distaff and spindle fell out of her slackened fingers. Fear gave her beauty. He delayed no more, but took on his true form in normal brightness. Though panicked at this sudden sight, the virgin was conquered by the brightness of the god. She checked her cries as she endured his force." Let me first say that this scene has confounded some scholars who see signs of consent. Firstly, the word meteor, which I have underlined, can mean brightness, but also splendor or even beauty. It is the same word for the gleam that remains after Daphne's transformation. Leucothoe is thus conquered to some readers because the sun is too handsome for her to resist. But conquering is also another verbal motif that runs throughout the epic in scenes of rape. So Tereus, when he has Philomela trapped on his ship, he yells out, "Wiki, I have conquered." So this is a key word. Next, Leucothoe's querela, her cry of complaint, is posita, set aside, which some view as indicative of consent. Lastly, Ovid's use of although, quam vis, has puzzled scholars. As Michaela Janan writes, although she was terrified she suffers rape makes no sense, given that it sees the princess's capitulation as happening despite terror rather than more logically because of it. She goes on. Part of the description seems to support the assumption that Leucothoe was a willing object of Saul's attention. Posita querella, her complaint having been set aside, victa nitori dei, conquered by the brightness of the god, could be read so, even though the phrase is fundamentally ambiguous. Yet the assumption that Leucothoe was seduced runs aground logically upon the phrase, she suffered rape. The sentence implies both seduction and rape, but neither connotation can be made to square with the other. We can never know for certain whether Leucothoe said yes or no to Saul's advances. We do know, however, that Leucothoe said neither yes nor no, because Ovid tells us she said nothing. And this silence does not indicate consent. The although makes sense when we consider that terrified rape victims are often expected to scream. With this word, Ovid, in fact, warns us not to take her silent as consent. Although she was terrified, don't think she wasn't, she did not scream and instead endured the rape. Silencing is a regular product of rape in Ovid, as we just saw with Daphne. Once we read Leucothoe's silence as part of a larger rape pattern, the sun's brightness, nitor, takes on a different significance. It is not seductive, but terrifying, confirming to Leucothoe that her assailant is a god. Indeed, Leucothoe herself later explicitly calls this rape, vis, in her only direct speech. He forced himself, vim tulit, on me against my will, in vitai. And this is technical language. So vim tulit is the way you actively say you rape somebody, you exert force. And then the language that we had before, vim passa est is a technical way of saying to be raped. It means to experience or to suffer force. So this is as close as you can come into Latin to our word rape. Okay. Translators again and again render this rape as consensual. Rolfe Humphreys, for example, writes, she was frightened, let fall the spindle and distaff, but even her fright was most becoming. He delayed no longer, turned to his true appearance, the bright splendor, and she, still fearful of the sudden vision, won over by that shining, took his passion with no complaint. Several details give the sense here that Leucothoe is seduced. She is not conquered, but won over. She does not endure, but takes. Force has become passion. This is no longer a crime of violent, silencing rape, but an act of successful ardor. Humphrey's translation has misled even scholars otherwise familiar with the epic's sexual politics. Jay Reed, a classics professor at Brown, recently annotated a new edition of Humphrey's translation. And his note here describes the son as gentler, more persuasive, and less coercive, even romantic. He goes on, Leucothoe, overwhelmed, is nevertheless consenting, although when confronted by her father, she presents the act as coercive. Now, any students who encounter this note are told that this is consensual sex and Leucothoe is lying about it. Humphrey's translation is not an outlier. In Charles Morton's version, Leucothoe does not endure force, but gives into him. She later accuses the son not of raping or forcing, but of plundering her, a euphemizing term that evokes the world of romance novels. Other translators render vis here as ardent wooing, Frank Justice Miller's Loeb translation, or advances, Stanley Lombardo from 2010. Some translators inject a sense of sexual titillation into the scene. Though David Rayburn is generally much better than others about using the word rape, his Leucothoe is not frightened, but shocked, and not conquered, but utterly dazzled. She does not suffer rape, but allows the sun to possess her. In Horace Gregory, the sun reveals his sudden heat, his manliness, at which Leucothoe trembles and welcomes his invasion. She later accuses the sun of dazzling her. David Slavitt, who admits to taking all kinds of liberties in his translation, gets especially carried away. The distaff falls from her numb fingers and onto the floor, making the only noise in a long and dreamy silence. She stares in disbelief as his features blur and change from those of her mother to new and grander proportions, It is indeed Apollo who stands there splendid and awesome. The girl, meek, is in shock as he comes to enfold her in his strong arms. These changes seem meant to give readers a sense of erotic titillation, making us complicit in a rape that has been glossed over and concealed from us. So why did I translate vis in this scene as force rather than rape? You can see it in yellow there, my translation. Primarily, I wanted to maintain Ovid's clear focus on rape as an abuse of power. From Apollo's flaying of Marsyas to Minerva's defeat of Arachne and Juno's blinding of Tiresias, the Metamorphoses is a study in such force, and it is not always sexual. To translate the word simply as rape may obscure links with other types of force in the epic. One particularly interesting example comes at the beginning of Book 7, where Ovid introduces a series of girls succumbing to illicit, overwhelming love. The first of these, Medea, describes her situation thus: some strange new force, nova vis, draws me against my will in vitam or in vitam. With vis and in vitam, Medea employs the language of rape, the same language used earlier by Leucothoe. This resonance invites us to ponder the many entangled ways in which love exerts violent power on a variety of bodies throughout the epic. Elsewhere, I do often use the word rape to translate vis, though always coupling it with the language of force, such as forced rape or rape forcibly, which felt redundant, but I wanted to make sure I kept the language of force intact. In conclusion, this talk, I hope, has shown how my experiences as a classicist when reading this text through a feminist lens have been crucial, both creatively and interpretively, to my work translating a textual corpus that, like Daphne's metamorphosed body, cannot tell us how it wants to be understood. Such work has been re-energizing to me as a classicist, and I think it can also re-energize the field of classics. For years now, there has been an understandable drift away from the languages, even as courses in classical studies have continued to attract a range of diverse students. The study of Greek and Latin risks becoming concentrated in a few elite institutions that are inaccessible to many. I think that leaning into creative and literary translation can help us draw more students into literary and language study and can open new, compelling ways to interpret and connect with these old texts. One step toward this is for the field to more readily embrace the role of the scholar translator. The current outlook for this is mixed. While some translators, such as Emily Wilson, receive wide acclaim for their work, classics departments are still simply not hiring faculty whose primary activity is translation. And many talented translators, such as Diane Arnson-Svarlian, have had to carve out room for themselves outside of academic institutions. On the other hand, there has been a marked rise in articles, panels, books, and lectures on translation. And you indeed have invited a scholar translator to travel an ocean's length to speak here today. For this, I am grateful, and I take it as a hopeful sign that a metamorphosis is finally underway. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an inspiring and detailed and thought-provoking talk. There will be plenty of time for questions after. We are now very fortunate to have a short response by Dr. Ian Calvert, who is Deputy Director of the Institute and also lecturer here in the Departments of English and Classics. Ian has published Virgil's English Translators, Civil Wars to Restoration, and his work focuses on translation of classical epic. So Ian is going to offer a short response, and then we will open the floor for questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Lindsay. One of the traditions of the Morse lecture is that somebody connected to the institute which hosts it offers a short response. But it's a real pleasure to be given this opportunity to respond to Stephanie's wonderful talk, which is about bodies changed into other texts. I'll wait for the doctor to stop chiming. Maybe that would be helpful. I'm not going to compete. It's only 6 barrels. So as Stephanie has just been talking about, Ovid's poem is fascinated with the process of translation, of the impact on bodies as they move from one way of being into another. And it has been just as fascinating to hear about Stephanie's process of transforming Ovid's Latin into contemporary English. Ovidian transformations often suspend a body between two states. And translation, too, involves acknowledging, but not necessarily reconciling, the interplay between the original text and its new form. That constant negotiation of sameness and difference helps us see more clearly what is so distinctive about the Metamorphoses. But it also helps us see what is so distinctive about Latin and English as languages. Translations, then, are highly worthy of analysis and attention in their own right. They are as valuable and informative for people who can read the original as for those who cannot. Whatever forms of access we may have to the sources, translations are always texts to be looked at as well as looked through. Etymologically, translation is a kind of carrying across. And I personally have really loved hearing about how Stephanie has carried some of the key features of Ovid's text across into her translation. That's Ovid's manipulation of the enabling constraints of meter, of rhythm, of pulse, right down to the level of an individual foot, of its highly patterned sentences, of its linguistic pyrotechnics, the bonds that Ovid forges between individual stories that come many books apart, such as that link between Procne and Hecuba that certainly passed me by. I clearly should have been reading more carefully. But while some features of Ovid's Latin can be carried across into English, Stephanie also spoke about how other features are best represented through workable equivalents or substitutions. So alliteration or other forms of soundscaping function, I think, as ingenious stand-ins for Ovid's use of chiasmus and Ovid's golden lines, the kind of untranslatable golden and silver lines in English. And I especially enjoyed that formulation of that kind of practice as a translator, as learning tricks from Ovid. I think that shows that as well as translating Ovid's text, Stephanie translates in an Ovidian manner. All of this is just to confirm my suspicions that those who call translation the impossible art are just not trying hard enough. Stephanie acknowledged that one of the greatest challenges a translator of Ovid faces is how to render puns and wordplay in anything that approaches either the text or the spirit of the original. That is perhaps where translation as an impossible art has perhaps a bit more to kind of bring that to bear a bit more. If I can make my own pun, Stephanie's talk made me think about translation, and particularly the translation of Ovid as a kind of implantation. And I don't just say implantation because so many characters in Ovid become vegetation, right? That there are trees and bushes and shrubs and flowers. I say implanting because any translation also involves thinking about how a text implants types of subjectivity in its readers. That is why it is so illuminating to place a translation alongside other translations, as well as in the original text. As we have seen by doing this, recent translations of Ovid have too often either flattened or ignored the complex subtleties of how Ovid implants subjectivity in his reader. Who are we viewing this from? What kind of attitude should we associate with that subjectivity? Should we endorse what is being said or what is being thought? Recent translators also flatten or ignore the way that Ovid sets various subjectivities in dialogue with each other, by that triangulation of Apollo's subjectivity, or what we can know of it, of the narrator's subjectivity and what we can know of it, and also of Daphne's subjectivity and what we might be able to know of that. When that flattening of those forms of subjectivity and the dialogue of those subjectivities is kind of happening, whether that's something that's occurring deliberately or unconsciously, it means that those translations misrepresent Ovid to the point of distortion, as I think we've all just seen. And the consequences of doing that are especially problematic when it comes to narratives of rape and of sexual violence, as we've just heard with Apollo and Daphne or Leucothoe. Stephanie's translation avoids the, to me, surprisingly widespread practice of including details which endorse a voyeuristic male heterosexual gaze that sexualizes vulnerable bodies. As Stephanie has said, these details misrepresent the Latin text or are unprompted additions to it, or perhaps to other receptions of that text as well. I thought so much of that emphasis on whiteness, on gleaming, is clearly picking up on certain references to nito or shininess, kind of brightness, but also the Bernini statues, or the kind of neoclassical gleaming white statues of the Restoration 18th century. So trying to overcome that or to sort of work through those kind of problems is why you refer to Daphne's parts rather than her hidden charms or her beauties. And I was struck by the fact that the examples of other translations that you were providing came from relatively recent translations, right, often kind of last few decades or so. And I used the advantage of having advanced access to Stephanie's paper to trace the presentation of Daphne further back in time into the period that I am most at home in, which is the Renaissance, the 17th and the 18th century. So I went back to the Renaissance translations of Arthur Golding, of George Sandys, and of John Dryden. And I found that Golding and Sandys also refer to Daphne's parts rather than, for example, charms or beauties. Dryden does use beauties, admittedly, but he does so in a context that makes it very clear that the term beauties represents only Apollo's way of thinking about Daphne's body. These translations, so these 16th, 17th century translations, are very careful to separate Apollo's voyeuristic gaze and thoughts from those of the narrator. They are not consciously or inadvertently aligning themselves with Apollo's attitudes in the way that so many more recent translations do. Golding and Sandys and Dryden are also notably nuanced in their treatment of Daphne's agency and that question of consent. They really preserve that sense of unknowingness that is so present in the Ovid and so strikingly absent in so many other English translations. So some of Stephanie's own choices as a translator strip away some of the unhelpful and inaccurate assumptions that are present in recent English versions of Ovid, but they also restore some of the subjectivities that are implanted by Ovid and the earliest English versions of the Metamorphoses. So like Golding, like Sandys, like Dryden, Stephanie recognizes that for all of his wordplay, there is an ethics of translation as well as an aesthetics of translation. Stephanie's Metamorphoses demonstrates how to acknowledge ethics and aesthetics when translating, not just equally, but simultaneously. I could obviously say a lot more about Ovid and the things that we've kind of been hearing about today, but I don't want to kind of hog too much of the space. I wanted to kind of throw the floor open to kind of questions, whether that's from questions from people who are here in the room or from people who are attending online. And we have a roving microphone to be kind of in action if anybody does have any questions. So maybe just start if there's anybody in the room, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, Stephanie, if you wouldn't mind coming back up to the front. Oh, lots of hands suddenly, maybe just far back there.
Thanks. Thank you for that. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed the way in which you took Ovid's language about forced sex, basically, and the way in which you brought out the relationship between vis and in vita. But there's a horrible chasm in the word vis, because it's also the second person singular of the verb wallaby.
That's right.
So it's, and I think that may be something about the choice of quamwis in the, because in some sense, it's bringing in the notion of, do you want it or do you not want it?
Really interesting.
So the, you know, the wordplay there
Yeah.
is in itself an extremely violent.
Yeah. Yeah. That is super fascinating. I had not really thought about that before. And it's making me think now that maybe Ovid is inviting us to think about, and in yoking the in Wita and we so closely together, and he does this a lot. He is making us ponder whether or not people want this to happen, right? He's bringing in this connotation of consent in some ways through maybe that connection. But this is something I've not thought about, so I'm going to ponder this. That's fascinating. Thank you for that. Yes. So do you think that he's implying in some way that he's making you question whether they want this to occur? Is that how you read that play, or?
Well,
I'm throwing the question back at you. I apologize.
where I think he brings this whole question out very powerfully is in the Ars Amatoria.
Yeah.
Where he talks about the word vis.
Yeah.
And he plays upon the conjugation of wallet.
Yeah, we said grata es grata, right? Puellis, right? Force is pleasing to girls. Yeah.
It's clearly a theme.
Right.
You know, to what extent is consent a question which arises in these situations?
Yeah, and that also that's really compelling. And so I am translating, I have a contract now to translate the Ars Amatoria, and one of the things I'm going to have to think about is, is translating at the very end, book 1, where he just outrightly promotes rape as a strategy and says that girls really enjoy it. It's a big question with Ovid is the narrative voice of the Ars Amatoria the same as the narrative voice of the Metamorphoses? If it is, it's so upsetting to me because I want them to be different, because the narrator of the Ars Amatoria seems so sympathetic to ideas I'm sympathetic to, and that is the notion that rape is it's a crime of power, right? And also that it's not just a crime because it denies guardians of women their property rights over them, but that it's also psychologically impactful for the victims, right? So I feel like Ovid is so attuned to things, but then the Ars Amatoria comes in and he's such an utter cad. It's so hard, and something I'm thinking about a lot is how to reconcile that to myself. But yes, certainly in the Ars Amatoria, I think that there is probably a pun at work there with vis and volo, right? So you've given me much food for thought as I embark on this new translation. So I'm really grateful for that. Thank you.
I think there's one just there, so if they can get the microphone.
Well, first, thank you for that really splendid talk. It was fascinating throughout. Could I ask you about your desk? What your desk looked like as you were working? Obviously, you'll have had Ovid open either virtually or in paper. Similarly, your own laptop with your text.
Yeah. Did
you have a limited number of other translations constantly at your elbow? If so, did they include Ted Hughes? Did they include also any translation into another language than English? Because that would lead me on to reflecting how far the strategies at the micro level and the macro level that you've been analysing so clearly relating to English translation, are they replicated either in a similar way or differently in translations into French, German, Spanish, Italian? Not fair to ask you all that, but I ask it all the same.
I'm going to try and remember all of the parts. It was a splendid question. I'll start with the other translations. I was trying very hard not to look at translations, and not because I was worried about, well, maybe because I was worried about getting words stuck in my head that didn't belong to me. This was my main worry. Ted Hughes, I actually tried to avoid because his poetry is so great that I knew something would rattle around in my brain that would be left over, right, from Ted Hughes. So I had to be very careful about what I was looking at. And yes, I didn't want to become stylistically indebted. And one of the great advantages I had when I was translating is that the first translator of Ovid's Metamorphoses I ever read was Mary Innes, which is a prose translation. So I didn't have a competing poetic translation that was my first experience of Ovid. So I didn't have, like Ted Hughes, who has such a powerful voice, right, in his tales from Ovid. Mary Innes' powerful, wonderful prose translation, but it wasn't poetry. It wasn't kicking around in my head. So I was trying very hard not to look at the other translations. In terms of my desk, another great thing that happened was I wrote most of this translation when I was on a sabbatical living in Brisbane, Australia, which means that I had to take with me only what I could fit in my suitcase. So I had scanned many books, but they were mainly things like commentaries, and I was using dictionaries, and they were like, it was the scholarly apparatus for the most part that was around. But I kept, I had poetry on my desk a lot. So the poet that I think inspired the translation the most was Philip Larkin, who is my favorite poet. And so I was reading like Ovid regularly, which to me is the most powerful poem that's super formal, straightforward language. And it was the thing I was emulating in a way, but aiming at the way he uses alliteration. I think Philip Larkin probably inspired more than anything that kind of patterned alliteration. Death is no different whined at than withstood, right? Where you have the D-D-H-H alliteration. So yeah, I was reading Shakespeare. And so I was really thinking about the poets that I admired, but that weren't translating Ovid, because I didn't want those translators and their poetry to compete. So my desk was, very sparse in some ways. It was a table on a beautiful veranda listening to kookaburras and non-Ovidian animals. And I kept wanting to sneak in like the transformation of somebody into a kangaroo, but I didn't. But that's a wonderful question in so many ways. I wanted to answer it in many ways, but I hope that does answer some of your question.
We've had a question from one of our online listeners, which is Olivia Walters, saying, I find the reading of speechlessness as a result of rape and trauma in the Metamorphoses really compelling, and something I'm very interested in studying. One thing I noticed while reading the Latin text was the fascinating linguistic similarities between the verb muto, to change, and the adjective mutus, on silence. I wonder if this informed your translation process and interpretation of the text as a whole. I would just love to hear more on your reading of speechlessness in this text.
Oh, that's really brilliant. That's great. Yes, mutus as an adjective means, unspeaking, right? And muto, mutare is a verb that means to transform. It's his chief word for transformation. There's another Ovidian pun. I think what I was thinking about a lot is this, and it's not, and silencing is not just an outcome of sexual violence, right? I mean, any person that's transformed into an object or a creature is silenced, right? But the more interesting thing to me in terms of this phenomenon is the ways we communicate in a transformed state that are not just speech. We communicate in all kinds of ways that are not through speech. And for Ovid, the most powerful way that people will communicate is through art. And so Philomela, for example, is a rape victim in the Metamorphoses who is literally made speechless when her victimizer cuts out her tongue after she threatens to tell anything or anyone who will listen. And so she reclaims her voice through the production of a textile. And so we have weaving as a really powerful way of thinking about voice and communication. And I was speaking at the workshop yesterday about how Ovid uses a spinning metaphor in the very first lines. He asks the gods to deducite perpetuum carmon, to spin out a perpetual song, an unceasing song. So they're spinning the thread that he will then weave. And so this idea of, the voice of the poet is a kind of weaving, and how even when you have been transformed, when you've been silenced, you can still turn to the artistic process as a way of reclaiming that voice. And so it makes us think about, different ways that we express ourselves that are not just verbal, but through cleverness and craft, right? And I think Ovid is really attuned to those issues. And not to digress too much, but when I was asked by Penguin what I wanted on the cover, my editor at Penguin, Elder Roeder, I can give her so many shout outs. She's phenomenal. And she's been with me every step of the way. When she was asking me what I wanted on the cover, and I said, I don't want a single myth represented. I really want something that screams like women's agency. Like, I don't want a single myth that has a victimized woman on the cover. That's on so many covers of things when it comes to Ovid. And I said, I'm more interested in Philomela's tapestry than I am her rape. And then they put this beautiful tapestry on the cover of the book. So it was a way to sort of center this idea of agency and speech in a way that emphasizes, the craftiness of these women rather than their victimization. So I'm sorry if I didn't speak directly to what she wanted me to, but it sent me down a...
If I could just leap in, yeah. I was also thinking, just as you were saying there, about craft as sort of non-verbal means of response or assertions of agency, but there's also so much, isn't there, in Ovid, of the shading of the verbal into the non-verbal, with all the people who are turned into plants, but people who are turned into animals, and the sort of the way that their cries or their voices seamlessly kind of learn into mooing or kind of bird song, and whether that's another form of thinking about where does the language of humans start and where does non-human language kind of pick up.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking of Niobe, right? I mean, after she's been transformed into stone, she still weeps for her children. And it's a really powerful realization, I think, to realize that in the metamorphosed forms, these people still are there in ways. They still have their feelings. The people who have transformed them have tried to get rid of those things, right? And they can't. So there's this, I mean, to me, it feels quite hopeful that those, people who have power and transform you, they can't take away who you are, right? That those feelings, those expressions, they remain intact, and sometimes eternally, right? Niobe is a rock that will live forever. She will always weep. She'll always feel the loss of her children, and you can't take that away from her, right? And to me, that's actually quite humanizing and hopeful in a way. Yeah.
Thank you. Were there any other questions? Lucy.
Hello, thank you. That was really very interesting. I wanted to ask you about the very last thing that you were talking about the need to embrace the scholar translator. And I've been thinking a lot about different ways of knowing about these ancient texts. You can know about them, as a scholar, you can know about them as a creative, you can know about them as a translator. I wondered if you had any more to say about the sort of intersection of these different forms of knowledge and ways of knowing about these texts.
Yes, when I say that, I don't mean, only people who've studied Greek and Latin for, 25, 30 years can assume the role of translating those. But what I want is for people who are deeply grounded in that text in some way, right? I feel like for a long time, the field of classics has just handed translation over to others, right? We can't, or we won't, or we don't do that, right? So we've handed them over to others. I want classicists to feel as deeply invested in this process as anybody, right? When I turned to translation, I had a colleague at an R1 institution say, we would give you gratitude, but not tenure, right? I want us to extend more than gratitude to translators. Even at a liberal arts college in the United States, I waited until I had tenure before I started translating. So for me, I feel like the people who are the most deeply invested in the text, who have been, discussing them with students, maybe not in the Latin. I mean, so much of my teaching with Ovid and so much of the strategies I came up with were informed by teaching them to students in gender studies, right? But people who have been deeply invested in these texts in a very variety of ways. It's just to me that we get those people translating because they're the ones who have been thinking about them really deeply for a long time. That we don't just say, this is not a task for us, we'll leave it to others. I think that, a lot of people who have been teaching and thinking in the field of classics, I think the biggest stumbling block is the creative writing aspect. And I think for a long time, classics has not folded creative writing into its interdisciplinary big tent. We have folded lots of things, with the original interdisciplinary field, right? But for some reason, creative writing, it's just a little scary. So just, bringing those together a bit more, incorporating creative writing more into classics, I think could only benefit classics. Does that help to eliminate some of my thinking?
There's a comment in from the analysis which maybe kind of speaks to that in the UK context, saying in the UK you can submit a translation to the REF and the Research Excellence framework, but people very rarely do, probably because institutions are too risk averse. Might it be possible to create a scaffolded translation publication genre as with a PhD in creative writing? So I guess that's more a kind of open question. There's a hope there's something that can happen, that kind of classics and creative writing as disciplines can be more in dialogue with each other and kind of harmonious dialogue with each other, here as well as in the US.
Absolutely. I mean, it's very hard. There in the US, there are non-existent amounts of fellowships that a person who wants to devote a year to translation can apply for. I don't know what the situation is in the UK. I was talking to colleagues from Australia, and they said they wouldn't even know where to apply for funds to anywhere that would fund a translation. So, I think that there are structures, not just within the fields, but, within larger structures of academics that go against turning towards translation. I do this work because I'm part of an institution that creative writing flourishes at. My hallway in my building is 3 classicists, 2 English professors, and then creative writers. So we're very kind of intermixed with one another in that regard. We have the Sewanee Review, which is the longest continuously published literary quarterly in the United States. I'm imbued with creative writing all the time. So it was just a natural environment for me to do that. And I don't know if I had been hired into a different institution, if it would ever even have occurred to me to become a translator. So
I think we've just got time for one more brief question, if anybody has one. One right at the back there. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. I really very much enjoyed it. And apologies in advance for this slightly nebulous question. But I was wondering if you gained any particular insights into the writer, and particularly in terms of the style of writing compared to other texts in Latin that you may have looked at. Thank you.
Well, Ovid's style is very different from most other poets. And, having spent so long with Ovid, now having to completely recreate myself a bit to translate Catullus, which is what I'm most immediately working on. But I gained insights in other ways. Ovid surprised me in very pleasant ways as I was translating him, less because of his style and more because so many of the stories that I had focused on in both my teaching and my writing prior to starting this translation were the tales of violence. But the thing that surprised me was how amazing Ovid is at presenting the other side of that. So many of his tales are about mutual love. People often refer to Apollo and Daphne as the first love story of the Metamorphoses. It's not. The first love story is Deucalion and Pyrrha, who are a long married couple who have all that lovely mirroring language. They perform, they're the shared subject of something like 25 verbs, right? You don't always know who's even the subject of the verb when they're around. And that's what surprised me. And I think it did surprise me in terms of style, how beautifully Ovid could mirror these relationships syntactically, right? And I really wanted to bring that out. It became important to me because Ovid, he doesn't want to tell just like give you one side of love, just present it as a violent force that victimizes and transforms. more importantly, he balances that by saying that love is a force for mutual desire, right? For, seeing, not objectifying, but it's humanizing. It's, in the case of Deucalion and Pyrrha, quite literally humanizing. They turn rocks into people, right? So that's what surprised me, which is why I can't just let the Ovid win out who relishes this victimization. This is a view of Ovid that he's just, he's so aligned with the voyeurs that this is all, that this is, he relishes the details that he describes. I cannot get behind that Ovid because I found too much of the other side of Ovid when I was translating his text. Yeah.
That emphasis on mutuality feels like a really lovely point in which we can transition from this stage of the event into the next one, which is that there will be drinks and other refreshments kind of served downstairs in the Heppel room. I guess all it remains for us to do is to thank once again this year's Morse lecture for a really fascinating and wonderful talk. And we look forward to more translations that will be coming our way from you in due course. So yeah, thank you very much.